Hello, welcome everyone. This is Upgrade to First Class with calculation groups for Power BI. This is a introductory session. My goal today, if anything, is to get you to start using calculation groups. If you've heard about them, they're in preview in Power BI Desktop, so my goal is to get you to start using them. My name is Jason Romans. I live in Nashville, Tennessee with my wife. Just a little bit about me. The main thing I want you to know, or the thing I find funny, is my favorite data model I named TARDIS. And it's so funny because with the new company I'm with, we were acquired. There's all kinds of emails and meetings and discuss TARDIS and learn more about TARDIS. And it's just kind of funny that I named this not knowing how much that name was going to be mentioned. And in case you're wondering, yes, that data model is bigger on the inside. Little Doctor Who reference. So here's the link for speaker feedback. We really do appreciate the feedback. I can learn more. I will have this link at the end too. So if you don't get it now, I'll display it again. So before we move on, I just want to say that I wouldn't be here if it weren't for those that have taught me, that put out content, that blog, that speak, that mentor. I know the phrase is standing on the shoulders of giants. I think of it kind of my flight instructors, people that have taught me and showed me the way so that I can go on and teach others the little bit that I know. So our journey today is, first of all, why calculation groups? And then how to create those. And then we'll look at calculation items, which are in calculation groups. What happens when you introduce multiple calculation groups? And then lastly, we'll conclude. So why calculation groups? Well, it starts with one measure, sales amount. But then you get asked to create a variation for each. Sales amount month to date, sales amount quarter to date, sales amount year to date. You kind of see where this is going. What about same period last year? Now I have all these measures. Now I have to maintain all these measures. And then the business comes back and says, okay, can you do the same for this measure? So we have total cost quarter to date, month to date, year to date, same period last year. And now we have these other measures. Part of the problem is it's difficult to manage these variations. Your model now has a list of measures that you have to go search through, look through to find the measure, and then just change whatever you need to change in that measure. We're talking at least 4 variations, if not more. Sorry. My first model, it got really bad. It was an analysis services, Visual Studio. You had to put all your measures in a little grid. They wanted the measure period 1, period 2, period 3. So I had 12 variations just for that one measure, not without any other logic put on it, just period 1, period 2, period 3. You can see why I like calculation groups. Also, with all these various measures, it's difficult to switch between them. So example, if I want to place one of those variations on a slicer, I want to be able to look and slice between year to date, month to date. That's not easy to do. So going with the flight analogy, we kind of have these routes, and this is just for one measure. You can see how things start getting complicated as we introduce more measures, more variations. If we could find a way where time intelligence is our flight path, and then we're just going to send along those planes of quantity and sales amount down that route, And we only have to maintain that route. So we need a better way. If we look at what is going on, the pattern is the same. Year to date, year to date, year to date. It's only the measure that we're changing. So if we could find a placeholder for the measure, then we could accomplish this. And I know some people, they're really good with DAX. The first thing you think is, well, maybe a variable. But that doesn't work with how we're doing this. So we need something else. Because the rest of the code is exactly the same. It's just that variable. So if we had a method where we could keep the pattern and just insert the measure we need, our life would be a lot more simple as a developer. So this is what calculation groups were designed for. All we need now is a way to handle that measure variable. So, selected measure is going to be our friend. So it's selected measure. We can put that now in our DAX code. And then as we say, okay, I want to look at sales amount, selected measure will replace sales amount in that spot. Same thing would go if we had total cost. Total cost would now be in that spot. And you can see just from this slide, our year-to-date is not that complicated, but it's all in one place. And we're just going to switch out those variables, those measures. And if we ever have to come in here and make a change, maybe there's something to the logic of, oh, well, actually it's years to date, but we also need this, or we need to change it for fiscal periods. It's all in one place. So now we have a method to handle those different measures. But what are the other benefits? So like I said, we have fewer measures to maintain. It is definitely easier with Power BI Desktop, Tabular Editor. You can search for things. Analysis services, when I had to deal with that grid and trying to organize it and move things around, or even Power Pivot in Excel, and you're trying to maintain all those measures, it's not easy. We can reuse what's already been created, use on multiple measures, and then we also can control formatting. So what does this look like? So this is time intelligence with one measure, sales amount. As you can see, I have the slicer on the right-hand side where I can actually slice and do quarter to date, year to date, same period last year. Maybe I only want to show one. And again, once I give it to the user, now they're in control of changing that. I can also put two measures. Same thing, give it to the user, they can control what they want to see. Now we go where we actually have two calculation groups, which I'll cover later, time intelligence and statistics. So if you want to look at max or min or average, we can actually mix those so we can look at time intelligence with our statistics, or pick a metric with time intelligence. Now our calculation group's new. It surprises a lot of people, and I know the dates kind of argued a little, but around 2019 is when they were created. The problem was, up until recently, you had to use Tabular Editor. So when I first did this, created this session, it was Tabular Editor only. That was the only way to do this. Now they're in Power BI Desktop. Currently, right now, I know we have the Fabric conference and everything coming up. Right now, it's still preview. You have to enable it. And I think this being in desktop is going to increase the adoption. Because I know at certain companies, unless it's in Power BI desktop, you can't create it, you can't use it, it's not encouraged. There's a lot of people that don't even know Tabular Editor exists. So how do you create them? So there's two ways, like I said, Tabular Editor, Power BI desktop. Let's start with Power BI desktop. So the first thing you have to do, and I know there's multiple ways in Power BI desktop to get here. Now I think there's the little gear icon in the bottom right-hand corner, but you need to get to options and settings and then go to options. We need to go to preview features and we need to enable model explorer and calculation group authoring. And like I point out, there is a little link that if you're like, okay, I need to read some more about this feature, you can click there. Again, in a month or two, if you're watching online, this may be part of general availability and you don't have to do this step. So once you do that, not only are you getting calculation groups as an options, but you're also getting the Model Explorer in Power BI Desktop, something we kind of take advantage of if we're using a tool like Tabular Editor. You'll notice on the left, it added that little model view, or I'm sorry, the model view has always been there on the left, but if you click on it and we look on the right, there's actually tables and then now appears model. So if I go back a screen, it's not enabled. On the right-hand side, I cannot see that model. If you do not see that there, then you have not enabled that feature. So once I enable it, I can go to model and now I get to see more details that were always kind of beneath the layer, info about the model. So again, if you have that Model Explorer off, you're not going to see on the ribbon create calculation group. Once I have enabled it, there's now a new button to click to create a calculation group. The first thing when we click this is the point that some people eject and they're like, okay, I'm out. I don't know what this means. It's giving me almost a warning. If you enable this, it will discourage implicit measures. That's a lot for someone to unpack if you're just trying to, I just want to use this feature. So first of all, what's an implicit measure? Implicit measure is when we do not hide the value columns like quantity, amount, and we allow users to drag those over and have Power BI figure out what we want to do, and then we can go and change it. But that implicit measure may be a sum, it may be a distinct, it doesn't have formatting, it is not an explicit measure that you've created to give the best experience to the user where you control the logic, the formatting. So best practices is never to use implicit measures to begin with, to always hide those columns and build a measure on top. And I know that's hard for some companies, some environments, there may be fights, but if you can do that, you're now providing the best experience to your developers and users. So again, we're just dragging that column over. Explicit, again, we are in control. We can make changes. Maybe later you actually need to add a filter to one of those measures that implies some business logic that you wouldn't be able to do if you just drag the column over. So coming from a DBA SQL background, to me, this is like the SQL views, that there's the data underneath, but we're controlling how it's being used. So discourage implicit measures. That's a really good word because it really should be prohibit. So even though it says discourage, once you say yes, you can't use implicit measures anymore. So as soon as I enable that and I say, okay, it just said discourage, I'm going to go ahead and use it still. I drug over the column and now it cannot aggregate on that column. It has to do columns or put it on rows. It is no longer something that can be aggregated or find the count of. So we'll go back to actually creating the calculation group. And like I said, I didn't want to belabor the point, but that is important because it seems like you did something wrong. And it's like, no, you're just accepting your model is going to change a little. So we accept this change. And then now we're in the calculation group view. Calculation groups are not scary. They're just a table. It has a column that those calculation items are going to be stored in. It has our normal formula bar where we can create those calculation items. The simplest one, in Power BI Desktop, when you say you want to create them, it will actually put the formula at the top that is this. You have to name it. A lot of people name it value, current, but all this is saying is all I want is whatever the base measure is. If it's sales amount, return sales amount. Because calculation groups are nice, year to date, month to date, but usually on the left, I want to see what is the original amount before I do the time intelligence. So I will say the experience in Power BI Desktop is very nice. Like they've made it to where you can move stuff around, drag and drop, fill in things. It is a very nice user experience. The slides may change some depending on what they add or if they, get feedback on this. And just like with some of the other tools we have, we can see the properties of our model now. And you can even see that the discourage implicit measures is on, moved over to yes. We can move that back, but we have to first delete all the calculation groups, and then we can restore that. I don't know why you'd want to, but you can. So let's look at this in Power BI Desktop. So this is just a Power BI data model that does not have calculation groups enabled. There's our nice little star schema. I've already turned on the preview feature. And if you notice, I now have that model right there. So now I can go ahead and start creating my calculation groups. Like everything, there's going to be different ways to do it. I can right click, I can click the little button right here. Again, some of this may change. They have tried to make it very easy. So there's that warning. I know I want to accept that, otherwise we don't go any further. If you look, it made calculation groups a table. So nothing scary, it does not have any relationships. It's basically a disconnected table. We'll talk about some of the columns in there later. So it already said, hey, I'm going to give you one calculation item, and it's what we talked about earlier. It's just our base one. Again, people rename this different things. They'll rename it value, current, whatever you want to rename that base measure. I also want to go ahead and change the name of the calculation group. So I'm going to name the whole calculation group time intelligence. The column that we're going to see in Power BI Desktop, I'm going to go ahead and rename. A lot of people rename it the same thing as the group itself. Totally up to you. It's a personal decision. Maybe your company has a certain practice. So again, I'm going to create a new calculation item. So I already have the code saved out. The nice thing is if I have the name, then it automatically names it. So I have two calculation items in that group, my value, my original, and then year to date. I can continue on. Let's go ahead and just do quarter to date. And then I have this new table over there that I now can use in my reports. So there we go. I now have one calculation group for time intelligence. I do see I'm not really crazy about the way it's displaying them. I would like value to be to the left of quarter to date, and that is something we'll cover. But I've created a calculation group. I've created a couple of calculation items.
And you have it automatically to rename the value so it becomes the name of the measure below.
That I've never, so the question is, can you automatically have it so it will rename the current or the value to the name of the measure? Yeah. That I've never tried, so I would have to look into that. And if you want, I'll have my details on the slide at the end. You can contact me and we can look that up. I'm almost sure you can, because all the current or the value is just DAX code. So if you can do it with DAX code, yes. All right. So we've created one calculation group, a couple of calculation items. Not crazy about the way that it's not in order. So I do want to show you another method really quick, that if you use Tabular Editor, you can also create these calculation groups and items too. So why Tabular Editor? It can speed up your development. You can access features not in Power BI Desktop. So again, calculation groups you could have been doing for the last couple of years before anyone else could. And also, it's another tool in your tool belt that maybe the person next to you doesn't have. Or when you are looking to advance your career, that you have more than just someone who's just used Power BI Desktop. So if you do a full install of Tabular Editor, it installs it in the External Tools tab in Power BI Desktop. All a calculation group is a table. So if we go to the table list, right-click, create new calculation group. So that one, again, I've renamed Time Intelligence. And then I start creating my calculation items. This is Tabular Editor 2, which is the free version. There are ways to speed this up. So I can go ahead and right-click and duplicate the first one I created, come in there, and then change that code and keep repeating that. And so I quickly can create my calculation groups. if you have the paid or commercial Tabular Editor 3, you can actually script out the DAX code, do the same thing for those first sets of calculation groups, go in, change what you need to. But the good thing is if you save that DAX file, you can now go to multiple models and deploy that to all the models that need it. When you're connected to that Power BI desktop file and you make a change in Tabular Editor, currently it says that you do need to refresh it. And all that is you click it and it does almost like the calculate and just makes it so it's ready to use. We're not talking full refresh of all the data. So in calculation groups, we had those calculation items we created. The first thing we really didn't like is once we put them on the visual was they really were out of order in our mind. So there is a hidden column in that table called ordinal that basically that's what it's doing the sort by. So just like we do in the model when we sort month name by month number, it's doing the exact same thing. And here you can see it, and it's got the little hidden symbol. So we can right click, move things up and down. Power BI Desktop also allows us just to drag things. That works. Like I said, that experience, I do like that experience. Tabular Editor is the same way. It also has just drag and drop the order you want. So one of the things with calculation groups is now we're dealing with a whole group of measures. So what if we don't want the format of the original measure? An example is we're using sales amount. It makes sense for us to have it in a decimal, to have the original format. The first time you really start to go, this doesn't look right, is when you get into percentages. Because in a percentage, you're just going to return the original measure format of a decimal. So in Power BI and Tabular Editor, you can change that to a custom format string. So if I select the year-over-year percentage, I can go in and change that format string to be percentage. And if you notice, it does have a little slider for yes, I do want a dynamic format string. All that is a DAX expression. What we did there was just a very simple, I just want percentage. You can start to, and this is kind of where you take calculation groups and get a little more advanced, you can do dynamic format strings where you're actually using things like selected measure format string to do dynamic strings. So an example would be currency, that you'll have this long bit of DAX code, but then it will return that format string for the particular currency you're trying to return. Again, this is more of like almost advanced topic, or okay, I'm using calculation groups. Now I want to kind of take that to the next level. So I'm going to really go in and look at how to do dynamic format strings. Another thing is maybe you don't want a calculation group to apply to certain measures. The biggest example is things with percentage, like margin percent. We may not, or we do not want it to take that percentage and try to do an average over the percent. So we can use isSelected measure in our code to say, hey, if you're this measure, Or maybe you're not. If you're not this measure, then do this piece of code. If not, just give me the original measure. So this is the example of the average, that if I'm not margin percent, then I'm going to go ahead and calculate the average. But if I am margin percent, just return the original. So now we're kind of coasting in now. And we want to look at multiple calculation groups. This is where things get a little bumpy. And this is where, depending on how far you go with your journey, you're going to have to research, you're going to have to test how to use multiple calculation groups. So the first thing we have to discuss is precedence. So I had one calculation group. We don't have to worry about precedence. You could create a model with just time intelligence, one with metrics, one with this. You're not going to have to deal with precedence. Going back to the flight path, do we apply max on the first part of our journey and then look at year to date? Or is it year to date and then we're going to look at max? Just looking at this and not looking at any code and not testing, it's not intuitive. How would I know? So the higher the number has priority. There is a setting, Tabular Editor, Power BI Desktop, where you set the precedence of each calculation group. Not the item like we did for ordinal, but the whole group. And that is important to know because your year to date is not going to have a higher precedence than your quarter to date. Again, do not let this prevent you from using calculation groups because you're going to start with one to begin with. Then even if you go two, once you know the order, whether you're told, you figure it out yourself, examples, trial and error, with two, you're going to get the right answer and be like, okay, that is the order from now on. So if I started out, I have my time intelligence and I have my statistics. Which one has the higher precedence? If I started down the route of, okay, max or statistics is going to have the higher precedence, this is the code that I would be looking at. If I take that measure code and plug it in, this is what I'd be looking at. So the year to date gets plugged into the one that has the higher precedence. So the higher precedence to me is the shell. And then the lower precedence gets kind of put into that shell. So this is what I end up with max. Now I'm going to go ahead and replace the measure. So this is what I'm going to be calculating. Is that what I want? Does it return the number I want? It doesn't. And the reason why is because I'm applying the year-to-date first, and then I'm going and actually calculating the measure. So I can take two, again, trial and error, and all I'm doing, I'm not going in and changing all this code. This is what's happening behind the scenes. What I'm doing is I'm going into that little box that says precedence and saying, this one now has a higher precedence than this one. Let's try it and see how it works. But if you're really going to do multiple calculation groups, you want to understand what's going on behind the scenes, you'll want to simulate what it's actually doing. So if I switch it where now time intelligence has the higher precedence, the max gets put into that. The difference being we now are going to open up the year-to-date filter. We are going to widen that filter. Then we're going to use the max iterator on those months. So if we're in the first month, we're only going to look at the first month and see what the max is for that first month. If we're looking at the second month, February, we're now looking at January and February and doing the max and figuring out which one of those is greater. So it's a matter of, it's basically order of operations. Again, if you're not sure, all it is going in and changing that around. Again, when we're dealing with stuff like year-to-date, time intelligence, simple measures, if your measures start getting where you're doing kind of very custom code, then you're going to have to learn what's actually going on. Again, like I said, you may have to do that code yourself. But once I know, in this case, time intelligence gets a higher precedence, it does make it easier because now, okay, my statistics is always going to be a lower. This is where you may go off the runway, is if you start taking the code for calculation groups, because remember, it's just a table. Calculation groups behind the scenes is just a table. If you start writing DAX measures and you are using calculation groups in those measures, I want to call year to date. I want to apply that filter, and you're calling the calculation group in your DAX code, at that point, you need to watch the warning signs. You need to know what you're doing because there's a lot underneath that may go wrong. Things like sideway recursion. And you can do examples where you have this measure calls this measure and this measure calls this measure. The good thing about this, it will not do an infinite loop. It will not keep calling each other infinitely and lock up desktop and crash, which is good. But there's no warning that this is happening. And what happens, it basically will only call it once and then say, okay, my counter said I've already called this. I'm not going to keep calling it. And then your code just doesn't return the answer you thought it did. Again, this is if we're using calculation groups in DAX measures. So really, best practice is not to do that. We've already shown how calculation groups are valuable, just calling them the way they are. There are special cases, and you will need to research this. A little more of an advanced topic is, okay, I'm using direct query. How does calculation groups work for direct query? And again, if you do have any questions, if there's things I haven't talked about, or, well, I have that special case, at the end, feel free to reach out to me. And then again, that calculation groups in the DAX code. So if we apply multiple calculation items, it just will return the original measure. So if we're actually slicing, or let's say we have nothing, we did not pick anything, which means all the calculation items, it will just return the original measure. If we select multiple, it will return the original measure because it can't figure out which one it's actually going to use. So at this time, does anyone have any questions? Yes. Let's see if we can get you a microphone.
Hello. You talked about something being a preview feature. Is it the calculation group that's a preview feature, or just viewing it in the model in Power BI desktop?
So it's viewing it in Power BI desktop. That whole model explorer view is in preview. But since about 2019, if you use Tabular editor, you could create them in Power BI, your semantic model in Power BI. So it is that model explorer, that being able to do it through the UI. So if you're asking like, well, which, because you could go to an older version if maybe your company doesn't have the newest version and do it with Tabular editor and it works. Any other?
Can you prevent users, when you publish everything, etc., you said that they can choose then apply calculation groups, prevent so that they cannot use a measure that doesn't make any sense, or kind of like say that this is not to be used for these calculation groups or something like that?
I mean, the easiest way is to do it in the code, to where you're doing that only if it's this code, do year to date, only if it's this measure, or the opposite, if it is this measure, don't do this. And then obviously it has to be, on the slicer, it has to be available to them. And does that answer your question? Okay. Because if not, we can go to the experts lounge or whatever and figure it out. Any other? Okay. So
Hi. Do you know why they disable implicit measures? Technically?
So the little bit I've heard is that is a current situation. It is something that could change. Having implicit measures has always been kind of against best practice, but it's because behind the scenes, it is doing a measure replacement. So an implicit measure is not a measure. So to take that and put that in the code, it's not a measure. That is something that could change. I'm not sure the priority or if that's something they're working on. I will say, again, kind of going to the, I have some very complicated calculation groups. Another thing you may run into is every time it sees selected measure, it's going to replace that with that measure. So again, if it's an implicit measure, there's nothing to replace it with. So I do think calculation groups are worth investing in your time. I think it does make it better as a developer of the model, that it's easier for me to maintain those measures. I also think we start getting into the user and giving them a better experience. There are other uses of calculation groups and I can show examples if we have time, where you can just have the metrics like field parameters where you have the metrics. So I want them to be able to look at sales amount, click. I want them to be able to look at total cost, click. So again, try creating with Power BI Desktop, but I encourage you to also try Tabular editor if you haven't, and just see what that experience is, especially if you're going to have to deploy calculation groups to many models. So here's the speaker feedback again. I'm going to go ahead and show that Power BI desktop model that has the multiple calculation groups, including metrics. Just going to wait a second for everyone to take it. Okay. And this is one of those things where, okay, now we have 3 calculation groups. So again, if we go back to precedence, which one comes first? Well, we knew time intelligence came first, and then statistics. Now we have metric. Turns out you need to do metric first, so it replaces it. Then it does time intelligence, then it does statistics. But I can come in here like field parameters and just say, okay, I just want to see the margin. And that is a calculation group. And all that calculation group is just calling that measure. Obviously, you may have to train users on the experience. And if I'm giving them multiple calculation groups, what does that mean? Or maybe you find ways to actually display the measure. But what does it mean if I do this with average, with year to date, and multiple measures? So if I want to see sales amount, year to date, and it's weird because I'm clicking on current and then I go year to date and it doesn't change. And that's what we talked about earlier, that if you try to apply multiple calculation items at the same time, then it just will return the original measure. Now, I'm not saying if we have this on columns and we're able to display stuff on columns, I'm saying if we have this one and we try to select multiple items, I'm just going to get the original value. So it may be one of those that you need to move to, okay, I want to see these across columns by time intelligence. So there's sales amount, year to date, max, all applied. And again, if I was doing this for the first time, I would have to figure out that the metric does have to be applied first, then the time intelligence, then the statistics. Are there any questions? And I know there's a lot here, and we've it's, this almost could be a 100-minute session, because once you kind of learn, then you can start trying different things with them. The slide deck will be available. Like I said, if you have any questions, if you're like, I'm having problems with this, or even if you're like, hey, go to the expert lounge, can we talk more about it? I'm free for that. This does have a link to my blog. It also has, from there, you can go to all my contact info. Were there any online questions? Okay. All right. If no one has any more questions, oh, yes.
If if using Tabular editor calculation groups, it also disables or prohibits the implicit measures, yeah?
Correct.
All right. It either way, it just doesn't. Okay.
Correct. It's not a Power BI desktop thing. It's once you create that, the engine has to figure out calculation groups, and it does not know how to handle an implicit measure. So I just wanted to say to everyone, thank you very much for attending this session.